How are you doing? I'm Joe Dallas. Thank you for joining us. This is an era where we're big on affirmative care, isn't it? If, if a boy says, I think I'm a girl, why, he is offered gender affirmative care, affirming his desires. If a woman says, this thing in me is not really a life, it is a choice, why, we affirm that decision and say, all right, we affirm whatever direction you want to take your pregnancy or terminate your pregnancy. In fact, it seems in general in the helping professions, we're taking our cues from people. If they say, this is what I want, this is what I am, this is what I feel, it seems like in the helping professions, more and more we are saying, well, then it's our job to simply affirm what you want, unless you happen to be a born-again believer who wrestles with same-sex attractions. And you are saying, I do not want to give in to these attractions. I do not identify myself as gay. I do not align myself with the goals of the LGBTQ movement. Would you please help me? Oh, no. Now that's controversial. Oh, controversial, good grief. In some countries, that's illegal. Those of us who do offer counseling to people who are dissatisfied with unwanted same-sex attractions do what I call affirmative dare. We dare to affirm people's personal desires to exercise their own God-given autonomy. And it's something we plan on continuing to do regardless. Well, one of the best spokespersons I know for the affirmative dare approach is our guest today, Andrew Rodriguez. Andrew is a personal friend. He's a Christian psychotherapist. He's a speaker. He's an advocate for therapy equality. That's what we're really talking about. He is also the director of Integrity Christian Counseling in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. And you got to check out his YouTube channel. You're going to love this title, Psycho Bible. Psycho Bible. And I laugh because is that talking about a Bible that has become deranged, or is it talking more about integration of psychology and theology? I'm pretty sure that it's the latter. At any rate, what a pleasure to have you on. Andrew, thank you for taking the time to be here. It's always good talking with you, and I'm especially glad we finally got you on the podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Joe. I'm kind of beside myself because this is such an honor just to speak with you. I wouldn't have known 10, 20 years ago when I started looking into all this stuff that I would be one day talking with one of my heroes in this field. So this is pretty amazing.
Oh, man,
Thank
you
you
are
again for the
very,
opportunity.
very kind. Been 20 years that you've been doing this, right? About?
Well, I mean, I think about like I started developing an interest in this stuff early 2000s.
Hmm.
And so when I was in college, I started college in 2004.
Hmm.
So close to 20 years that I've been interested in this stuff. And that kind of brings me to how I got started in this whole field.
Well, how
Um,
did you get started in this whole field, Andrew?
it's like God just he kind of put me in it. I came to my undergrad. I was working on my bachelor's in psychology at a Christian university or Christian college at the time, Valley Forge Christian College. And my intention, because I'm also an artist, and my intention was to get my psychology degree and then go to art school and become an art therapist. And I wanted to work with
No
kids who had
kidding.
been traumatized. That was the original plan. But God just started bringing people in my path who were struggling with sexual issues, whether it was pornography addiction, and I became an accountability partner, or friends who were dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction, and I just became like an accountability partner to them. It was just one guy after another. And then also, my older brother came out of the closet my freshman year of college,
Ah,
and so there was that whole experience. So I've approached this from multiple angles as someone who has a loved one who's gay identified and still active and in a relationship, and just there's been other people in my personal life that are in some way involved with homosexuality. And but when I was in college, it was a really different environment than how it is now. Thank God. Um, there was a very old school mentality at the time that it's just a sin issue. You need to discipline it.
right.
And I had the blessing of doing my undergrad internship at a ministry that was part of Exodus International. At least at the time it was.
Hmm.
And I had it in there because the director at the time was also an adjunct professor at Lancaster Bible College. And when I was a junior and senior in high school, I took some courses there. And so
Uh-huh.
I took some of his classes he taught. And so I I was like one of his top students. So he said yes, he made an allowance because I usually didn't take undergrad interns. So I got to participate in the recovery groups when I was there and uh, work alongside guys who are struggling with pornography, heterosexual sexual addiction, along as well as guys who are working with unwanted same-sex attraction. And it was just a powerful internship experience. But when I came back to school the following semester, I just knew so many other guys who were dealing with this issue, but they were struggling in secret because my
Hmm.
campus didn't have any counseling services on campus. And the way they dealt with sexual struggles was very arbitrary. They either might send them home with a devotional to, or they might kick them out of school.
Yeah.
And eventually, what happened was some friends of mine, or rather, friends of my fiance, not my wife, they were struggling with this, and I was just getting to know them. But one of them was involved with a guy who used to be involved with my old roommate. So God spoke to me and said,
Okay.
yeah, he's like, freshman year, when I noticed this going on with my roommate and this one guy, I didn't know how to address it. And this time now, 2 years later, God spoke to me quite clearly. It's like, freshman year, you didn't do anything. This time you are.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, God, what do you want me to do? So I spent a week in prayer. And at the end of that week, another friend opens up to me and says he struggles with this issue as well. And that's when it's like clear as day. God told me, you're going to start up a support group on campus for guys who struggle with sexual struggles, but in particular, God said homosexuality.
Hmm.
So I'm like, all right. And I know there's a problem on campus because it was sort of like they had a don't ask, don't tell kind of approach to this issue. So I'm like, all right, that means I got to confront these friends and tell them, hey, I know about what's going on, but I want to offer my help as an accountability partner. And I'm going to start up a group for guys who want help. And then that was nerve wracking because I didn't know them very well yet. And then I had
I
to talk to
bet.
student life. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a testing period for me because I was not necessarily a confrontational person by nature, but I think God was shaping me through this experience because then I had to talk to student life. And the head of student life at the time was very much opposed to having a group on campus because he wanted to make sure that they had to go through student life where they could get disciplined first.
Hmm.
And he wanted to make sure if we had a group that I would report to him if anyone broke any of the rules of the school. And so there would be no confidentiality.
Right.
So we butted heads, and eventually, long story short, it's one of my favorite stories to tell, but it's a little long. So I'm going to skip some of the fun details. Eventually, what happened? I joined forces with another professor who had a very like mind, and he had a similar heart, and he also had some background working with guys with this. So we joined forces. We start our own group underground for a bit, but then what happened, thank God, was there was already a support group on campus for girls who were dealing with abuse from their past, and they wanted to bring one on campus for guys. And by this time, I had already graduated, but my wife was still a student, and I'm like, I want to leave the campus in a better place than how I found it. So I started up this support group for guys who are struggling with pain from their past. But every school year, about half the guys were dealing with heterosexual sexual addiction, the other half were dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction. And so that's just how it panned out. That was the way God did it. And I just developed this passion for it. And then like the whole time when I was in college too, I was studying sexual struggles.
Uh-huh.
My friends called me Dr. Sexpert. I was the guy who I love
Classic.
studying things like gender identity confusion and sexual dysfunctions. I predicted back in 2005, I'm like, this is going to be the issue that is going to make or break the church this generation.
Hmm.
And it's proven itself to be true much faster even than I had predicted.
You bring up some pretty important points. One of them, you've a few times used the term unwanted same-sex attractions. Now, to your thinking, what is the difference between someone with unwanted same-sex attractions and someone who just says, I'm gay?
Yeah. Yeah, this is important to make that distinction because these days it's being all lumped together.
Yeah.
And there used to be an allowance for this in the DSM. The old DSM
Hmm.
3 would allow
That's
that,
right.
okay,
That's
if
right.
you had same sex attraction, it could be ego syntonic, meaning that you identify with it and you're okay with that, or ego dystonic, that it doesn't
Right.
match your view of yourself.
Right.
And so there was a place for people with unwanted same sex attractions where the attractions at your core, you realize that this is not a reflection of your values, of your identity, your purpose, your intention for how you want to live and how you want to express yourself and behave sexually. And so the desires are in conflict, to sort of quote your book there, are in conflict with your design and your identity. And so there used to be a place where people could get help that matched those values and those
Sounds
desires.
reasonable.
Yeah.
Sounds reasonable. Yeah, but I think that's an important distinction because I found the same thing too. In fact, listening to you, I mean, our stories are very similar in some ways, obviously, and others not, because this has been a part of my own background, also in my own struggle. But when I was in training to become a full-time counselor, shoot, I didn't want to deal with this. I, like you, I had another goal in mind. I wanted to do drug and alcohol rehab type of work.
Hmm.
But I kind of stumbled onto this, and I love the way you phrased it, Andrew, because I say that quite a bit. God just did this, or God just did that. Well, that's, I mean, that seems to be the way it works out. God just makes it clear that there is a particular need that very few people are tapping into, and the need for someone to address people within the Christian population who are silently struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction. That is a huge need. And I think
Yeah.
you seem to have discovered the same thing I discovered when I started, that, oh my gosh, you talk about what Jesus said, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers, man, they are few. So it seems like you kind of stumbled into something and realized, wow, there is really something authentically that I can do to address the needs of women and men who are dealing with this. You've been doing that for some time now, and I know your work. I've listened to you teach. I've looked at your materials, and I know you personally. So you're a good person to ask this question. Uh, Given that everybody's story is unique and every individual is unique, what common threads do you see among the people who you have worked with? What are some of the common conflicts that they bring into counseling that they're dealing with?
Well, there's a lot of explanations for how people develop same-sex attraction. And so there's a lot of
Mhm.
pathways, but one thing I explain to people is it's kind of you can take them all and kind of boil them down into two main funnels. There's unmet developmental needs and trauma.
Mhm.
Technically, though, you can look at it all as trauma because if you
Mhm.
don't have a need that's met, that's needed for proper normative sexual development, then it is a trauma because the outcome tells you that. And so, with that in mind, one of the things we often see are, uh, especially with men, I see this more so, is an insecurity about their masculinity, about their belonging among the in the world of men, and uh, their it might not always be at the point of gender identity, but at least gender security. Now, what may have contributed to that? It for some, it's very clear. It could be maybe having a very distant or uh, non-affirming or unaffectionate uh, type of relationship with their father. There was very antagonistic relationship with older siblings or with same-sex peers. Could also be from early attachment loss with mom. Uh, Oftentimes, we put a lot of the emphasis on the relationship with the same-sex parent, but what we find also is there's dynamic where they couldn't quite fully individuate from mom,
Good point.
and so that can set them up if there's that malattunement, a mismatch in what the child needs and what the parent is providing. That's what we call a malattunement.
Mhm.
That can set the child up to sort of just detach and
Right.
dissociate. And if that happens early enough in life with the relationship with mom, it sets a boy up to do the same thing when dad isn't as involved as a boy needs him to be.
Mhm.
And so there's a shutdown experience.
Right.
And so those are the contributing factors. It's now what we do as an adulthood. We can't necessarily go back and change those things, but now it's all right, rediscovering or discovering now anew your identity and the security in your masculinity, in particular with men. But I've seen this as well with women. I've working with some women as well. Um, and some of them, they had mixed messages from their mothers about what it means to be feminine. So they have to go back to those early roots as well. So in particular with men, we explain that, and they when they can actually identify a time they've experienced this, it really helps, of going into the self state of assertion. the authentic
Hmm.
expression of the self, your thoughts, your feelings, and desires. And what they find is when you're in that state where like I am expressing myself and I'm not being held back by shame, that if I express what I'm experiencing, but I believe I'll get rejected or I'll get hurt if I do, I'll make things worse. When you
Hmm.
sort of take the risk of being authentic, that undoes shame. And in that state of assertion, they'll find that homosexual stimuli just isn't very tempting. And
Now,
so it's a
I
matter
can
of,
testify to that myself, Andrew.
yeah. So it's a matter of integrating that so it becomes the regular way in which you live. Another thing we've been finding, and it's been a more recent thing as I've been doing work with Joseph Nicolacy Jr., is how many guys deal with OCD that also deal with same-sex attraction. I think the ex-gay ministries that I've learned under, this might have been a blind spot in a lot of their ministries for a lot of years. And I think this could be a major contributor to why we see a lot of treatment failure or people leave they might get involved in a ministry and then they leave disappointed because a lot of them when you have someone with OCD, and it might not even be HOCD because there's actually a subset of OCD called homosexuality OCD
Hmm.
or sexual orientation OCD where the obsession is, am I gay? So that's one separate issue. But just if you have OCD in general, there's this intolerance for uncertainty and a frustration. And so when they experience a temptation, they will get very worked up and they'll be very scrupulous and wonder if they commit a sin just by having the temptation or having a thought,
Hmm. Hmm.
being a little bit of attracted or drawn to another guy, and they'll get so fixated on it, and they guilt themselves, they shame themselves. So one thing I've been working on a lot with guys is helping reduce that shame and growing it in their acceptance of the experience itself. And the paradox is as they do that, it reduces the intensity of the sessions.
So part of what you're fighting is that sort of all or nothing mentality.
Oh yeah.
If I'm in sanctification as a believer, and I'll frame this more because I'm a strictly a biblical counselor, you are a licensed psychotherapist, and you can speak, I think, more adeptly than I can in clinical terms. But looking at it as a discipleship issue, if I'm a disciple in process, I've got these types of temptations, feelings, what have you. It's not in my best interest, and it's certainly not biblical to figure, oh my gosh, there's a temptation, and overreact to that instead of dealing with it properly. Like, okay, that's a reality of life in this fallen world. If I obsess over it, I'm only going to inflame it. And an interesting point that you raise here, we're talking about what you've seen and experienced in your practice. Now,
Hmm.
I can firsthand testify to so much of what you're saying. And yet, when I say what you just said, people will often say, oh, so you're trying to say that all gay men are this way or all lesbian women are this way. That's not what we're saying, but we can't
Yeah.
deny what we've seen. I
Hmm.
mean, all I can tell you is I can't speak for all gay men or all gay women or all same sex attracted people who struggle. All I know is in the years that I have done this work, this is what I have seen among the men and women, primarily men, who I have worked with. And what
Yeah.
I have seen absolutely matches what you're saying. I mean, what we can't do is deny our stories. And I don't think we can deny the fact that behind so much sexual sin, there exists, just as you were putting it, either wounds or deficits. Something may have been wounded or there has been a deficiency. And
Hmm.
again, you're talking about masculinity and assertion. I know some people will listen to that and say, well, I know a lot of gay men who are very masculine. What are you talking about? But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about perception, just like you were saying. A person may not be comfortable with his own masculinity, even if the guy's got 22-inch biceps and a voice that, deeper than Orson Welles. That's
Hmm.
not the point. How we experience ourselves has a lot to do with our masculine confidence or feminine confidence in the case of a woman.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah. It's also helpful to understand that there's kind of subtypes of homosexual presentation or experiences. And we're not saying it's all just one, though I would say about 3/4 of the guys we work with are those who had those early experiences of not feeling like they're masculine enough.
Uh-huh.
But there's also subtypes, especially if, like, say, the root issues start happening a little later in life. Maybe it was
Uh-huh.
after what we call the gender identity development stage of 3 to
Mhm.
5.
Mhm.
So maybe if it was more the play age or even adolescence, if there was some severe trauma or wounding or early sexualization or sexual molestation or experimentation,
Right.
it can imprint. And so then that's where it has a little more of an addictive element. And then on top of it, we get guys who have both types of major factors.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where you can get a lot of the guys who don't present as flamboyant and they
Mm-hmm.
don't present as
Mm-hmm.
effeminate, but
Mm-hmm.
they still have a compulsive homosexual behavior or pattern. And that's probably because they had the contributing factors a little later in life. So they had enough of that gender identity security, but then they got fixated on some sexual experience.
And I think that would account for the fact that, as I said, Andrew, over the years, I've known many men openly gay, identified as gay. And when I was a part of the gay community myself, I certainly knew plenty as well who were very stereotypically masculine. But the
Hmm.
profile you just described there, I think would have fit them very well. You know, the irony of all of this, it used to be a lot safer to talk about this, even in secular clinical circles. You could
Yeah.
talk about this and you could talk about it openly. Now, as there's been more of a clamping down on even a discussion of what variables could lead to a person's attraction to the same sex, the position currently in the culture is so prohibitive that, for heaven's sake, this is the kind of conversation that a lot of people would just shut down because, again, there's not room for an honest exploration of how we can best serve people who are saying, I am ego dystonic. I do not feel comfortable engaging in homosexuality. What can you do to help me? Which is a fair thing for people to ask, which leads to an important question too in light of all this. You just said some pretty controversial things. I agree with them, but they be controversial. What kind of pushback have you gotten over the years in your work, Andrew? Oh, that laugh
uh,
says a lot. Okay, gotcha.
so, as you know, so I started this support group after graduating college, or actually while I was finishing up, and I had been running it for several years before I finally started grad school. And I was working an office job. I was actually working at a counseling center, but I was just in the office staff and working full time. I think the one thing that kept my sanity was doing this support group that I was running
Mhm.
because it just made me feel so alive, just being able to work with guys and just being a partner with them, being a real brother in Christ to them. And so eventually I'm like, all right, because my job was it was a pretty rough job, my day job. I'm like, you know what? I wish I could just take the leap of faith. I was so scared of being able to afford graduate school. So I put it off. So by the time I started graduate school, I had already been doing this type of work for like 6 years. And so I started grad school in 2012. And so I went to a so-called inclusive Catholic university.
Uh-huh.
And I had to make a decision there. Do I keep the work I do a secret? Because I know a lot of therapists in this field, they didn't start working with guys with same-sex attraction until after they already had their masters and they started
Right.
encountering clients.
Right.
Me, I can't say that. I had already, as a layperson, been working with guys for several years. And so ultimately, what I decided was one day I'm going to stand before God, not the APA. And so I need to make a decision now if I'm going to be true and be honest about
Right.
the work I do.
Right.
And so I chose in the admissions process to be honest. And I got accepted into the program and soon found out that it's not a very Christian or Catholic program. It was a very secular one. Um, but I used it as my mission field. I was homeschooled all 12 years of grade school. So this to me was like my public school experience because it was
Oh,
an opportunity for me to
a
witness to
little late
people.
in the game. That's interesting.
Yeah, it was like it for me.
Yeah.
And one of the teachers pointed out, like, when you share your faith, there's something powerful that comes. And she was a Jewish professor. And but yeah, when the topic of conversion therapy would come up, I would take that as an opportunity to let people share their thoughts, which was all based off myths and misunderstandings. And then after they shared, I'd be like, well, I know a little something about this. And so then I would share what I know from the books I've read, from people I've worked with. Uh, Also, early 2012, I got to meet with Cy Rogers because my pastor used to go to the same church as him. So when he heard about the work I do, he was excited and he invited Cy Rogers to come speak. And I got to meet with him and Karen. And so, like, I've rubbed shoulders with just a few of the leaders in this field. And so I use it as an opportunity to share my experience and correct some of the myths. So I was open about it all throughout my grad school experience. But then 2015, I was 4 weeks away from finishing up my year-long internship and then graduating. And I get an email from the head of the internship program at my school telling me I must stop my internship immediately because they become aware that I've been working with men dealing with unwanted same-sex attractions and who have left homosexual lifestyles.
Which you had not been keeping a secret. You were very
I
upfront
had
about
not been
that from
keeping
the
a secret.
beginning. It's not like you pulled a fast one on them.
No, it's still to this day, I don't know why all of a sudden it became an issue.
Hmm.
Because the head of the internship program was also my group counseling professor. And I
Yeah.
talked about the group I ran in that group. But I don't know if he just went one ear out the other, but all of a sudden now he had a vendetta against me. And so I had to stop my internship. And what they did is they went around to other internship sites around Philadelphia, and they told them that they have a student who needs a new internship. But the reason that he had to stop his current internship was because he was committing unethical behaviors. So they
Whoa.
basically blacklisted me throughout Philadelphia. And so after several weeks, because this went on this was in June. It's interesting timing because this is how God works. All right. I get this email in mid or late June. I forget the exact date, 2015. The next day was the Restored Hope Network conference in Lancaster that I was going to attend. What better timing for me to get an email telling me I have to stop my internship for working with guys with same-sex attraction than to be the day before I go to the conference with all of these other leaders in this field. And so I got to share, here's an email I just got yesterday. So I got prayer from different people and I got connected with the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. And so I ended up having to get representation from a legal ministry here in Pennsylvania, the Independence Law Center.
Yeah.
And thank God for legal ministries. So people,
I'm with
please
you.
donate to legal ministries.
Yes.
Those
Yeah.
are one of the biggest
Big
things we
need.
need to be doing as churches is make that part of your budget as a church to support your local legal ministry because we're going to need it.
Yeah.
And so they came to my aid, and so it wasn't until like November the whole issue got resolved. So for a few months, I'm trying I just want to graduate at this point. And their decision was after they got all these internships saying, well, we don't want him now. They're like, well, we couldn't find a new internship for you, so we have to kick you out of the program. So yeah, that's, you talk about Christians and a cancel culture. I got canceled. But God used my canceling to actually advance me because what they tried to do to oppose me from going into this field actually helped propel me more into the field because I made more connections. That's how I got connected with Joseph Nicolosi Sr. I got awarded the Nicolosi Award for Student Excellence when he heard about my story, what I was dealing with. And then I started going to the Alliance conferences and meeting more people in this field. And I actually got to work with Nicolosi in his research team for a period up until his death. And then now I'm working with his son, being trained in reintegrative therapy since 2020. And it's just been one thing after another. And I survived it. It was difficult, but I was determined that even if I don't get to graduate, I still am going to do this work because once God tells you to do something, opposition don't hold you back.
Right.
Just like when I was in my undergrad and I was getting opposition for wanting to run a support group for guys. I knew clear as day God wanted me to run that group. So I just persevered. Well, God told me to do it, so it's going to happen one way or the other. So in the same way, if the world's going to give me opposition, I know God's calling me to do this. One of the things that ultimately got me kicked out was when they kind of interrogated me and a couple of the people on staff. They're grilling me with all these stupid questions. A lot of the LGBT activists talking points, like, what about homosexuality in animals? I'm like, this is stupid points you're trying to make.
Yeah, very relevant.
And I'm like,
I really need to know what a buffalo does.
They're like, oh, well, what if it becomes illegal? I'm like, well, it's not illegal, and I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm not doing anything unethical. I'm working with guys who are willingly coming to me. And at that point, I wasn't even trained in reparative therapy or reintegrative therapy. I was just doing counseling, just doing what I've been trained to do. They just don't like the goals that the client has. I'm supporting them in living congruently with their values. But ultimately, I said to them, all right, if it does become illegal, well, I guess that puts me in a position where I'm just going to have to practice civil disobedience because I know it's not wrong and it's respecting the client's rights. So
Mhm.
that's probably the point that got me kicked out. And then my lawyers later told me. So I'm like, all right, so be it. God used it. Eventually, ironically, I was able to graduate from there because what they did is I had enough credits for the lower degree because you need 48 credits for your master's, but you need 12 more to get your license. So I was already on track toward my license. I had enough to graduate the lower degree. So I graduated with that, but they wouldn't let me count my hours toward my internship that last semester. I was able to transfer somewhere else where they honored everything I did, and that was a good experience.
Yeah. Well, we talk on this podcast a lot about the concept of persecution. And what I've often tried to point out is that persecution doesn't have to involve somebody shooting you or throwing you in prison.
No.
We shouldn't be too quick to throw the term around, but when someone is limiting you, that fits the definition of persecution. When they are limiting your freedom of speech, they're limiting your freedom of expression, they're limiting you in a way which basically would prohibit you from speaking what you know to be the truth.
Yeah,
Jesus said they persecute you in one city, flee to another. Absolutely. And I often paraphrase that. If they persecute you in one industry, flee to another. If you're not able to speak truth here, you speak truth here. But ultimately, when your back's against the wall, you got to do exactly what you did. And that's in the spirit of Peter and John. Hey, guys, we ought to obey God rather than man. What else are you going to do? But you're
yeah,
bringing up a point, and I'll leave it at this for today, Andrew. I want to pursue more with you in our next episode together. Answering some of those crazy charges that were made against you. In fact, we'll go through several of the
mm,
claims or questions that people have for someone who does what you're doing. But this really is about speaking the truth and counting the cost. And we have a mandate to do both. We have a mandate to speak the truth regardless. And just like you said, we shy away from this type of thing. We shy away from pushback. And I guess, well, we should. I think it'd be a little weird if we want to be
oh yeah,
persecuted. But the reality was from day one in the early church, what did persecution do? It spread the gospel. For heaven's sake, put the Christians in the pressure cooker, and we're going to pop like popcorn. It happens. So I think that's a good example of it here. You speak the truth and you count the cost. We don't want to be silly about this. If you are saying what the world is not saying, the world ultimately is not going to passively just sit there. There's going to be pushback because the spiritual forces that are largely governing the trends that we're seeing culturally, and this is one of them. Whoa, Andrew, thank you though for standing firm. That's what we need to see more of, and it's emboldening to other people to hear your story and to see exactly the way you're approaching this. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, either to have you speak or to hear more about your services, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you, Andrew?
well, definitely. I have my contact info on my YouTube channel. Go to Psycho Bible. Also on Facebook, look for Psycho Bible, or you just go straight to my counseling website, integritychristiancounseling.care, CARE.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm going to look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you all for being with us today. If you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, won't you do so? Christians in a Cancel Culture, hit that button. Let me know you subscribed. I'd like to thank you personally. Also, if you haven't picked up a copy of my book, which this podcast is based on, Christians in a Cancel Culture, it's available through Amazon.com. That was written to equip the average believer to be able to intelligently and biblically discuss these hot button issues. If you'd like to support this work and align with us in this ministry so we can go on providing free content, just go to joedallas.com/giving, joedallas.com/giving. That'll show you how you can partner with us in this. Well, this is Christians in a Cancel Culture. We're with you every Friday. Thank you for joining me. Look forward to seeing you next week. Meanwhile, let's keep in mind the job description we all have. Paul gave it to Timothy. It applies to us. Anyone who says, I want to be a servant of the Lord, well, the servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle to all, apt to teach, patient, in meekness, instructing those who oppose themselves, if perhaps God will grant them repentance according to the acknowledging of the truth. 2 Timothy 2:24-25. Truth's important, but let's keep in mind when it comes to the truth, it's not only where we stand, it is also how we stand. Good being with you. God bless.